Penal labor, or prison labor, was introduced around 1865, immediately after slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment. The South's economy was extremely dependent on slave labor, resulting in a major economic crash and increase in poverty after the 13th Amendment's ratification. This economic crash spurred Southern lawmakers to find a loophole in the 13th Amendment, leading to the introduction of prison labor. Southern politicians enacted many black codes, which criminalized various things such as lack of employment or permanent residency, unlawful assembly, interracial relationships, violations of labor contracts, possession of firearms, and practicing any occupation other than servant or farmer without holding a judge-ordered license to do so. There were many other laws used to criminalize arbitrary actions exclusively for African Americans that varied from state to state in the southern states, which all imprisoned African Americans and forced them to perform wage-free labor in similar fashion to before the 13th Amendment was introduced. In the later half of the 1860s, southern states began to introduce convict leasing, in which prisons would provide prisoners to private parties such as plantations and corporations. This offered a much cheaper alternative to properly taking care of inmates, where private parties would use minimal supervision and have extremely poor conditions and unsafe labor practices. With the essential revival of cheap slave labor, the Southern economy returned to what it had been prior to the 13th Amendment. By 1868, Union occupation of the South and national pressure grew enough to repeal the black codes in the Southern states. However, over time, Reconstruction lost a great deal of enthusiasm and support, and casual racism steadily became more common, leading to another form of targeted criminalization. Instead of focusing entirely on African Americans, the South targeted poor people, which were mainly African Americans who had not adapted to the free market yet. The largest example of this was Mississippi's Pig Law, which classified theft of any property worth over $10 as grand larceny. This violation resulted in incarceration up to 5 years. Prison labor is deep-seated in racism and greed, introduced in a time where Southern racists were desperately clinging on to the slave labor system they'd become so accustomed to. Prison labor is still very prevalent in the modern day, offering very cheap and sometimes forced labor for companies. Around the United States, prison labor wages range from 23 cents to $1.15 per hour depending on the state and job. The most profitable prison system in America is the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, which makes about $90 million through labor programs in which inmates do not earn wages, but rewards such as time credits to reduce their sentences. Since 2010, there have been inmate strikes for better wages, conditions, and the end of forced labor, which is typically punished with indefinite solitary confinement. The prison labor system is the last functioning relic of slavery in the modern day, and is often considered modern-day slavery. Corporations and prison systems remain very profitable, typically exploiting forced labor of low-income African Americans through racially charged arrests to maximize profits, very reminiscent of the labor system created by the Southern lawmakers in the 1800s.